chapter 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. And now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages will not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to them to those who were seated, and so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." And so they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." And when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near to the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of the Lord. Well, we're still in the Gospel of John. Next week is Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday, and then Easter. I think I'm going to go in a little bit different direction then. But here we are in John today, chapter 6. 2 wonderful stories here. Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And then he walks out to his disciples who are out on the stormy sea. Everything from the first word of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, is brought us up to this pinnacle moment in John, and everything that follows flows from it. John throws a line so we see the significance of the moment. He says, "Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near." Passover, not just a historical moment, not just a few archaeological fragments buried in the dusty remains of a distant past. Yes, it's an ancient story, but it's also a promise to you. If you have ever found yourself stuck or trapped in some way, if you're living in fear, overwhelmed in some manner, full of anxiety, burdened with depression, whatever it is, hiding in shame, living with guilt. Why do you come here on Sunday? Why are you here? What are you looking for? This is a freedom story for you. This bread is for you. And Jesus is being, actually very super spectacular here. He's got, these thousands of people together, and he feeds them with a few loaves of bread and some fish. And it's amazing. Everybody thinks Jesus is wonderful. They're beyond excited because they know their Bibles. They're watching this being done, and they know their Bibles. Who does this kind of stuff? And they know. One of the most epic stories in the Old Testament, Hollywood made a version of it, the 10 Commandments, but Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner We're all old enough to remember that. Maybe not even upstairs. But, this epic story of the splitting of the sea. Pharaoh has freed the Israelites. He has allowed them to go out of Egypt. And then he has a change of mind, his heart. He dispatches his army into the wilderness to chase them down, his former slaves. The Israelites raise their eyes and they look and they see Pharaoh and the Egyptian army advancing toward them, and they are terrified. They scream, was it for lack of braves in Egypt that you have brought us out here to die in the wilderness? And of course, God saves them. The Almighty splits the sea, allowing Israel through, and destroys the Egyptian army in the waves. Super spectacular. Yet, if anybody who's familiar with the tidal waters along the coast, you know how possible something like this is. We got this, but it's an incredible moment. A very inspiring moment. The Israelites, they look at God and are awestruck at what God has done. The text tells us, Vayamenu, and they believed in God. In Moses, God's servant, they believed. They were awestruck at what had happened, what God had done, and they saw the plagues. Those plagues, they were all incredible, But compared to this scene at the sea, by the sea, that was all small stuff. An epic story, the whole thing overwhelming. God brought to bear the sea to carry out His will, saving His people, saving them and loving them. And in response, the people feeling that love of God, people feel that love, and they give it right back to God. And a great celebration there by the sea. They sing songs, and Miriam sings a song. And so the story ends right. It's in the way we tell it, and everyone lived happily ever after. I mean, that's kind of the way we tell it. Except that's not where the story ends. Actually, we're only at the beginning of the story. Up to this point, the story is it's made for Hollywood material, but it's incredibly inspirational. It's beautiful, but only when we read it in isolation. Only if you freeze the frame right there, with the swelling of the violins, and the romantic connection between God and Israel. And forget all about the things that happened afterwards that are coming along, but it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story. So what happens next? The people become thirsty, and they say, God, you're so amazing. Would you do it for us again? But no, they don't do that. They complain. We're going to die. Just 3 days out. 3 days after all that God had done for them, they are thirsty, complaining in fear for their lives. And what does God do in response? God saves them. And then immediately there's another story, following immediately, where people are hungry and they complain, God should have killed us in Egypt. In response, God saves them again, providing them with quail in the evening and manna in the morning. And then the panic, it escalates near even more in a third incident. The people are thirsty again, and they complain again. And Moses fears for his life this time. And in response, God saves them again. So does anyone here see a pattern? Right after the people declare their belief on the shore by the sea, they believe. Right after that epic, loving connection with God and the people of Israel, the people lose their faith. And for no apparent reason, it seems, because there's no indication God will stop saving them. Indeed, every time they complain, there's God saving the people again. But they believe there by the sea, but then their faith crumbles, not just once, but 3 times, with seemingly increasing levels of panic. Hunger and thirst causing their faith to just simply evaporate. It's a pretty consistent pattern and a distressing one. So what's going on? And I think maybe the answer can be found in the story that follows these 3 stories. It's a strange story, kind of an oddball story thrown into the mix of these 3 stories in Exodus. there is this people, the Amalek people. They who ambush Israel in surprise battle. And maybe if you were in school as a kid, you learned to raise your hands like Moses did over the battle. And as long as Moses' hands were raised, they were winning the battle. Then your Sunday school teacher said, lower your hands, and you did, was it like Moses did? And whenever he lowered his hands, the Israelites started losing the battle. Well, that's the story. But the amazing thing about this story is, unlike the 3 episodes where the people failed to believe, this time they have faith, they believe, and it all just comes right back. And we're left with a feeling of whiplash. I mean, what's going on? Unlike previous incidents of growing panic, increasing panic and fear, the people complaining about lack of water and lack of food, and again about the lack of water. Here, there is no panic. They are calmly following Moses' lead. What's our plan, Moses? The people listen, they follow Moses' instructions, and they win this surprise battle against Amalek. And so, why are they, here, so believing, so trusting, so faithful when it comes, to the splitting of the sea? And in their very first battle since leaving slavery with Amalek, but they're so full of doubt that God will provide in between when they are starving and thirsty. Time and time again, the people have failed. But then this, where they don't fail. What's going on? Well, basically, I think we didn't have this part of the reading, but basically, Exodus seems to be wants us to tell us. Exodus tells us what Israel wants to know, what they need to know, what the people are asking God is God in our midst or not? That's the question. The Hebrew word in our midst has another overlapping meaning as well. They're not just asking, is God in our midst? They're also asking, is God close to us? I mean, they could see God as the great protector in the big things. They saw God win great political battles in Egypt. They saw God could defeat their enemies. He was a great political military leader. I mean, wonderful credentials that way. But does God, when it comes down to my life, when it comes down to where we live, does God understand my world, our world here? Of a human leader, we want to ask, will he make sure the garbage gets picked up? And will that the roads are maintained, and that sewer and water are reliable, and that crime stays low, housing remains is affordable, and taxes stay low? Will our leader do this? Make sure that these things work for us? And there are these kinds of fears. They haunt us about human leaders. How much more so might they haunt us about God? Does God care about my little concerns? Will God do anything about those things? And can God really be close to me? I mean, yeah, he seemed really interested in defeating Egypt, but on the big stage for all the world to see. But when it comes down to my life, where I'm at, where nobody sees what's going on, does God care there too as well? Does God care if I have enough food on the table for my family? Care about my health and my well-being for the sake of my family? Provide shelter, food, water? Will God provide the support, emotional support, physical, mental, all the support that we need? Does God understand my concerns? And has He made these concerns His own? Does God have empathy for us? Is God close to us? So Israel saw God protecting them against Egypt, but was He really interested in Israel as much as He was interested in Egypt? That was the question. And when attacked by Amalek, they remembered, hey, God did this to Egypt, protected us against Egypt. Yeah, they're going to protect us here. So they were confident. They believed. They trusted God as their military savior. Sure, God had a great general in war, but now here we are. That's all, is God here now, as we struggle to survive? What about food? What about water? It's a struggle that resonates with us, doesn't it? Because, it's kind of easy to think of God as almighty and powerful and a sovereign God. Presbyterians like to think of God as sovereign. It's kind of an easy way to think. God is a great winner, a winner of great battles, God, sovereign over all the world. And I can believe in that God, but personally, is God with me in my personal life? These insignificant to everybody else but me things. Where is God when my bank account is too little to pay those big bills? Does God understand the sorrow and the fear that I struggle with every day? When it comes to the big things, my faith seems more certain, feels more certain. It's in the daily challenges where it's harder to muster that same faith. These stories seem to be wanting to tell us, to assure us that God is always there, making provision for our lives. There are the stories which are playing in the background of John. This is what's going on. These are Israelites. They know these stories. This is all in the background for them. They're hearing them. And God, the Lord, shepherding his people, doing great things for Israel through his servant Moses. Look, raise your eyes up and see. And when Jesus looks up and sees the crowd coming toward him, Jesus says to Philip, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? And we know that Jesus is testing Philip. Notice Jesus asks, where are we going to find to buy bread? In other words, Philip isn't in this all by himself. It's not up to him totally. It's not he's not alone. He wants Philip to continue taking the steps of faith that he already began to take earlier on in John. Philip's already on the way. But sometimes there are just things that seem too impossible. This is your next step, Philip. Do you believe? Philip responds, as any of us would. 6 months' wages. Couldn't buy enough bread for everyone here to get just a bit. Jesus is asking the impossible. It's absurd. It seems it can't be done. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, says to Jesus, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they? And we can hear Andrew struggle to believe. He points out the obvious impossibility. Yet simultaneously there does seem to be some spark, some faith, a very small spark that could be easily snuffed out. Yet it's there. And we're all just like them. We're like the young child eager to learn how to ride a bike but not knowing how, and frightened by trying to learn how to ride a bike. And we get on the bike and for a moment there we're proud. Look at me, Mom. Look at me, Dad. Wobbly, shaking this way and that. The bike tumbling over. We're falling to the ground, getting our knees, crying. We get up. Mom comforts us. We get on the bike, we try again. Andrew's little spark of faith becomes a springboard for one of Jesus' greatest signs. For God to show us what God all along can do through just a little bit of faith. Here's all we have. Jesus, this is all we got. Look, this is not much. We don't got anything. And in comparison to what the challenge is, what the need is, it's so meager. It can't possibly make a difference in such a gospel-hungry world. Confronted with the impossibility of our lives. The challenges that rip families and communities apart. They teach us to live in fear. Lord, we don't got anything we don't got what we need. This is all we got, just this little bit of stuff. So meager. Jesus isn't put off, unperturbed by their struggle of faith. Jesus orders them to get the crowds to have them sit down, and Jesus utters words that are now familiar to us whenever we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated. As with wine at Cana, there was plenty left over. And it's just, wow, amazing. People experiencing this abundance, openly expressing Hey, Jesus has to be the one, the prophet, who is to come into the world. They perceive he is the future Moses, foretold by the prophets. That he is Israel's political, military, and religious leader, come to restore Israel, to drive out the Romans and the collaborators. But in their sudden recognition of him, they also misunderstand what Jesus is all about. Jesus perceiving the people want to make him king and to do so by force, which means a coup d'etat. It's time, they tell themselves. He's our king. Let's take control. Let's usher in the kingdom and bring that long-awaited liberation from foreign domination. Let's make it happen. But Jesus is more than Moses and more than any prophet and different than any king they think they want. His kingdom, we will read later, is for this world, but it is not of this world. John, familiar refrain in John, his time had not yet come. Instead of offering them his transformative power as he had done in the sign of bread, what does he do now? He withdraws up to a mountain by himself. The best way to banish God's presence from our lives in the midst of the impossibilities in which we live is to take control. To take the kingdom by force toward achieving our own small and cramped purposes. Jesus will never be appropriated to our ends. He will always and only invite us to join him in his impossible ends, made possible through his power alone. And this is a very subtle but prevalent shift that can take place in our hearts. Instead of believing and trusting in him to supply our needs, we commandeer him to our plans in order that we might get for ourselves our ideas of kingdom, our plans, our ends, which are about us, without reference or deference to God. Our kingdom on earth, not God's kingdom on earth. This all brings us to the story, the second story in the text, the lesson. And the lesson of the second story is just basically, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It goes without saying, we're all afraid. In a boat, in the midst of a storm, these seasoned fishermen are handling things pretty well. This isn't their first boat ride across the lake. They look up and they see Jesus. Jesus has found them, and they are terrified. And he comes close to them in the midst of the storm. There is no place where God cannot reach us and come near to us. No matter how fierce the storm, no matter how far distant from shore, no matter how strong the wind and the waves, God comes near to us. The storm which is threatening, possibly raging in your life, God's there. Do not fear, only believe. Believe. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. They see Jesus is there with them. Are you like them now? Are you like these disciples? Willing and wanting to take Jesus into the boat where you are? This is what the disciples do in verse 21. They wanted to take him into the boat, and that's what happened. And when that happens, there's this wonderful thing that occurs. It says, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is what the Gospel of John wants to teach us. Over and over and over again. Receive Jesus. Believe Jesus. Trust him. Let him into the boat. Then you will be where you are meant to be, where you are meant to be going all along. When you receive Jesus, when you open up your anxious fist and welcome him, then you are where you will need to be. Where you long to be. The destination about which the Bible speaks, abundant, fruitful life, everlasting life? Believe. Take him by faith, receive that which you are seeking, believe. Do not be afraid. Nothing is impossible. Not even the greatest impossibility is too much. Believe. Nothing is too great. And to him we offer what we have, as meager as it is. And he makes it a great feast. When you think about the greatest impossibility, I mean, all of us aren't we? We're all faced with impossibilities. But we think of the greatest. It wasn't the crowd on the hillside who didn't have enough bread. It wasn't the people of God trapped between the sea and Pharaoh's army. It wasn't the complete lack of anything necessary for life in the wilderness wanderings of Israel. The greatest impossibility is the human race helplessly ensnared, completely captive to sin and to death, with no hope of any rescue, no hope of any way out. And Jesus does the impossible. Filled with faith and trust in his Father, he lets himself be taken to the cross without fear. Not my will, he says, but yours be done. And he lives and he acts with faith, and the Father multiplies his very meager offering. And this is the bread, says Jesus later. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread, says Jesus later, that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. It sounds impossible. But it's what Jesus is all about. It's what Jesus does. Believe. Do not be afraid. Believe. And I offer this to you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.